2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves, or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test. This is a passage that gives us a very important warning about claiming to be Christians, but in reality not really living up to the truths of the Christian life. But in order to understand this fully, we need just a little bit of background about this second letter of Paul to the Corinthian church. The Corinthians had been given false information by some super apostles to say that Paul wasn't really all he was claiming to be. He wasn't much of an apostle and he wasn't trustworthy. And so what Paul had to do was he had to correct the thinking of the Corinthians to stop looking on the external, but to focus on what really matters, and that is the reality of Jesus Christ. So Paul took the time to explain many things throughout this book, and in this final 13th chapter, Paul, instead of talking about being examined by the super apostles and by the Corinthians, now turns the tables and he points the question directly to them. In fact, he says, examine yourselves. You've been questioning me, and I'm proving in my letter that I am indeed an apostle. Now that I've proven it, I'm going to be coming a third time, and now I want to ask you to examine yourself. That's what Paul is trying to say. And not only does he say, examine yourself, you have to ask the question, what do I have to examine myself about? And he says in the next part of the verse, he says, examine yourself to see whether you are in the faith. Now, that's a sharp warning. It's not to say that he is trying to undermine their faith, but rather he's trying to show the genuineness of the faith that these believers have. And it's important for us as well, as believers, to take the time to check, are we really Christians? Does our life reflect Christian character, or does it bear fruits of the Spirit of God who is in us, Spirit of Jesus who is in us, if indeed he really is in us? It's not to cast doubt on anybody's faith or anybody's salvation, but rather it's to point out a need for honest, genuine reflection of the life that we're living. And once we do that, we then have an opportunity to change if need be. But the verse continues, he says, test yourselves. Or do you not realize this about yourself, that Jesus Christ is in you? And why does he have to say that? Well, let's remember, Paul was the one who brought the gospel to the Corinthians. And because he brought the gospel to these Corinthians, and they had believed, they had received the Spirit of God, they were now Christians by virtue of what Paul had done in his missionary journey to the Corinthians. And by saying that Paul wasn't really an apostle, what they were saying is, well, the gospel that Paul was preaching wasn't really effective, which would naturally mean that these people who were claiming that Paul wasn't an apostle were not really Christians. Can you follow? I mean, if I say that the person who preaches the gospel to me isn't really a Christian, then what I'm saying is the gospel that he preached to me wasn't really the gospel. And therefore, the gospel that I received and I believed isn't really the gospel. And therefore, I'm not really a Christian. You see how the logic works? And because of that, Paul was trying to turn the tables to help them realize that their accusation of him about his apostleship being false wasn't really something that would hold much water. So the invitation here isn't that they were false believers, but rather that they had to learn to be genuine in checking for themselves whether or not what they were was truly Christian or not. And it's an invitation for all of us. We need to be warned. Sometimes we think just because we profess Christ as Lord and Savior that makes us Christians automatically. My dear brother or sister, true saving faith will bear fruit. The book of James even expresses that when you want to prove your faith, you need to be bearing good works of righteousness that prove the genuineness of your faith. So why don't we check carefully? Have we truly believed? Have we truly become Christian? Are we really born again into God's kingdom? And is Christ really in us? Because if he really is, then there will be evidence, there will be fruit.